Hello and welcome to another edition of Military Matters with myself, Brian Gerrish, and Charles Malet. Charles, we decided this time we were going to have a little look at recruiting, which has been an important and troublesome issue with the military over a number of years, with some pretty staggering shortfalls. I've got a few statistics here for the year 23-24. So the Royal Navy achieved 60% of its target, i.e. a 40% shortfall. The Army achieved 63% of its recruiting target, so that's a 37% shortfall. And the RAF had a 30% shortfall. So these are pretty massive shortfalls. And of course, they come after a long period of time in which the government and the Ministry of Defence have been pretty keen to use commercial companies in order to fulfil military recruiting. And Capita in particular has been particularly in the spotlight over army recruiting, failing miserably over a number of years. But we're now in the interesting point where we see what I've described as an increasing militarization agenda in UK. We're seeing the government ramping up the path to war, largely on the back of the conflict in Ukraine. And so we're seeing the government talking about wanting a massive increase in military recruitment. And they've come out with a new initiative in order to do this, which is essentially bringing all of the recruitment under one organisation instead of allowing the individual services to deal with their own recruitment. And the other thing, which I just found out this morning, is that they're also looking for a massive increase in the percentage of women in the armed forces from about 12% up to 30% by 2030. And that, to me, is a pretty onerous recruitment target, albeit that one's based on women. How do you see things at the moment?
Well, to sort of take off, in a sense, from where we left off in the previous episode of Military Matters, we were discussing in our own respective sets of experiences how a lot of the things that looked like they had gone wrong, perhaps organically, were actually being made to go wrong, and that was granting the forever war, in a sense, in that the armed forces themselves appeared to be hamstrung. I think my view of what you've just described, particularly Capita taking on the recruitment in 2012, and now Serco, and now the idea that there's one point of contact for all recruitment, or one funnel through which everybody is supposed to pass, it is almost an extension of exactly that. It's as though the two parts to it, the policy and then the actual operation, are intentionally set to frustrate one another. It's very hard to see how the failure of Capita can be translated into a success by Serco, and then to look at that alongside the idea that the armed forces must be composed or comprised of such and such a percentage of, let's say, women in this instance, then moves us into different territory, because that can only be achieved by manipulation. You can't invite 30% of women to simply turn up and displace the otherwise male candidate. So somehow you've got to force that, and really the only way to do that is either via some sort of discrimination process, which obviously various employment laws and whatnot should prohibit, although in actual fact armed forces do have a different relationship to certain pieces of legislation, which perhaps we might come on to. But ultimately this points towards conscription, because that is one way in which you can, if indeed people do toe the line and go along with it. That is how you can populate an armed force with people who weren't otherwise planning on doing it. In other words, the enormous percentage of women that are expected to be in the armed forces that you're just describing that aren't yet there. So it's a situation, I think, that shouldn't be regarded in its own right. It needs to be looked at in the much wider context of what's been going on in this country. Well, I mean, I think for the purposes of this discussion, we'll probably have limited a bit, but I mean, you know, for well over 100 years, actually. But just on the women front alone, it is fascinating to think the House of Commons briefing paper, which came out in March of this year about conscription and putting out a subject in terms as though, well, this is something that people are sort of starting to discuss a little bit. We have no plans to do it. We don't think it's a good idea. We don't think it's necessary. And yet we're going to talk about it anyway. And we're also going to point to specific examples where it is happening. But the reason I mention it right now is that the front cover, they always put a photograph on the cover of these, you know, publications to give you an idea. And of course, it was a wartime photograph, and it was of a parade of women, all women. And that, you know, okay, subliminal perhaps, or maybe rather more than that. But nonetheless, the idea was very much that if there is to be conscription and the push for recruitment, this is to be aimed at or to include everybody, and that seems to be where the messaging is going. And I mean, we can come on to talk perhaps about the big documents that have come out this year, in particular the Strategic Defence Review and the National Security Strategy, which the message of both of those is this idea that I suppose in some ways was put out perhaps first by Patrick Sanders, who was then head of the army back in 2022, sort of almost immediately, that the apparent, or at least what's being described as Russia's illegal war of aggression, the moment that started, Sanders started talking about this whole of society approach. And I think that's how we have to consider all of this, and to look not just at where it's going, but sort of where it's come from. And I think that's the bit that obviously prior to this discussion we've been considering, is sort of where this has come from. And I don't think I'm going to suggest that there's any one point, but it is very interesting to think about what has happened over quite some number of years. I mean, you know, going back to your own experiences and the way in which personnel changed during your time in the Navy. I mean, I'd be really interested to hear your sort of perspective on what was happening then in relation to what you see happening now.
Lot to talk about, Charles.
As always.
It is an amazing subject. I just wanted to add in there immediately, before it goes out of my mind, that the new recruiting strategy, which is the Armed Forces Recruitment Service, this is where they're talking about recruitment being brought together for Army, RAF, Navy, Royal Marines, Gurkhas, but it all comes under one umbrella instead of it being done separately. But when you actually have a look at what the what has been said about this new AFRS system, the aim is to boost national security under the government's plan for change. So the first instance isn't that we've got a shortfall of recruiting and we need to address that, because otherwise the existing armed forces can't function. No, in the background we've got that we are deeply concerned about national security overall, and therefore we're going to run this recruitment system in order to boost numbers to meet whatever the supposed threat is deemed to be in the future. And for me, it's very clear at the moment that Ukraine is just being used as the point of fear for the population. Those nasty Russians are coming after they've dealt with Ukraine. And now young people and the wider population in the UK are being told we've got to ramp up for war. and therefore our recruitment is moving to a war footing. That's what I sense.
Yeah, I would absolutely totally agree with you. And I think that, again, that there's so much to bring out just from that. I mean, for example, the Defence Review, which exactly is prefixed on this idea of national security and the apparent threat to it, although that threat is never really distinctly articulated. So there's this vague sense that Russia is somehow inching its way towards British shores, of which there's absolutely no evidence either of it happening or of there being an intent for it to happen. And yet, nonetheless, the rhetoric suggests that we need to be prepared for it. We then have Mark Rutte pushing NATO, in effect, at the behest of Donald Trump to say, right, we have to have 5% spending on defence. But to exactly what end, again, is never made clear. What is it that suddenly changes at the 5% point? No one says that there is a metric by which success is
is a lump sum, basically.
It is absolutely. So it's the sort of spiral of interests, corporate interests, again described as being the defence dividend. So the suggestion being that if we spend enough money on this stuff, and I deliberately say stuff because obviously we've started by talking about people, but actually there's an obsession with stuff because that is how war is monetized. In effect, the arms manufacturers, the so-called defense industry, works on making and flogging stuff and capabilities, and not people. People have to come from somewhere else. But the kit bit is much easier, in some senses, to make happen. And indeed, when the flow of money is concerned, it's I suppose a more obvious relationship between state and corporations as to how that's done. But one of the authors of the Strategic Defence Review, Fiona Hill, a known Russophobe, an advisor to the first Trump administration on Russia, has said that she believes that we are at war with Russia, and she's also compared previously. She has directly compared Putin with Hitler, and I'm not dismissing out of hand what she says, but a lot of what she says, for somebody who was put in a position of writing what should be an objective document, it's hard to see how she could have been considered in such a light, holding the views that she does. But she believes we are at war with Russia. Well, in saying so, it's because she looks at what Vladimir Putin is doing as his effort to become the leading or dominant military power in Europe by an expression of, or a show of force in Ukraine. And of course, the inference in that, especially when we consider the language of the defence dividend and the whole of society response, is that mobilisation via the 5% spending commitment means that there is effectively an arms race within Europe. And we consider what's happened in recent times. Okay, this will be out of date a little bit by the time this comes out. The supposed story about incursion into Polish airspace recently and the response of flying British jets into Polish airspace. I mean, obviously, it was all based on an entirely incorrect premise. But the point is that it's very easy to see how the situation, at least militarily or strategically, can change very quickly. And I think when we consider that alongside the influence of people like Fiona Hill, who are absolutely determined that we should all be not just terrified of Russia, but actually seeking to go toe to toe with them, then that puts us in an I would say, well, not vulnerable exactly, but a difficult and dangerous position. I really do. So quite where we go next, it's hard to say, but there do seem to be a lot of factors pointing towards there being a necessity for war to satisfy all the other things that are going on.
This is a fascinating subject, because if you try and approach it in one angle, there's something else that comes up, and you think I
Yeah.
need to pay attention to that as well. Perhaps we can simplify things by saying, well, let's just at the moment leave the conflict to one side and the rhetoric for war, and have a little look at how the government is approaching military recruiting. And of course, it's very interesting that we've got the massive shortfall we have, because clearly one or two things is happening. Either the companies who've been tasked with recruiting are simply incompetent and they fail to produce a result in their contract, i.e. they haven't recruited enough people, or we've got young people who are simply not engaging with the idea of serving in the military. And therefore, if the recruiting companies, we could even say Capita as was, if they were doing a reasonable job, they failed because young people were not so easily hooked to say you need to come and serve in the military. And I certainly think there are a number of issues around this, which is to do with the fact that young people don't have the interest in the military that they could have. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of people watching and listening to what we're saying, and they're going to be saying, well, is it a good thing that we're recruiting young people into the military? That's something for another discussion if we just accept the status quo as it is and say, if we want defence of a country and you have to have armed forces, then you need to recruit people. So we're having a look at what it is going on with the young people. But I think what I've watched over a lot of years is the military change in a way that makes it less and less attractive for young people to join. And what am I talking about? Well, one issue is the fact that if you have a military system which is constantly contracting, when people leave the system, they're inevitably talking about the problems that they were. And in my day, in the Royal Navy, we were constantly short of people, often critical people. And this meant that obviously the workload on board a ship increased, but also the operational performance declined because you did not have the specialist people there to enable you to do the job. And that created pressure on the team that you had. And then inevitably that pressure would be one of the things that caused people to leave the service. Probably a good example would be in the submarine service, where the moment they didn't have enough people to meet the, I'm talking, the latter stages of the Cold War, the moment we did not have the numbers of submariners to man the submarines, particularly the nuclear boats, this meant that people were being cycled through sea jobs without getting respite from spending, time between deployments on a shore job. So the stress levels for these men went up and up. And some specialisation, nuclear engineers and also nuclear submarine heavy electrical or weapons engineers, there was a big shortfall in those jobs. So for men who were in that specialisation, they were just facing more or less constant time at sea. And eventually they got to the point where they're saying, I'm not going to sign on again if they were getting near the end of their time. And of course, their disquiet then spread once they'd left the military, because they might say, well, I enjoyed most of it, but, and the but is the thing that spreads. So cuts was something that were just continuous. And if we look at statistics, I've got some in front of me, but essentially, if we go back to, where are we here, the 50s, when we had a big peak in British military forces, Korean War going on, etc. But if we say the 500,000 men across the Army, Air Force and Navy, that that was the baseline for a great many years. But since the 60s, it was a constant decline. And very often defence policy was going to be a reduction. And so if you're in a business, commercial business, which is constantly shrinking, your ability to recruit is going to diminish. That's a simple fact. So I've watched this happen. And then on top of it, I've seen that the style of the military has been deliberately changed by these new policies, including women coming into the military, and as I've said before, including gays coming into the military. And I know some of these are very sensitive subjects, but they need to be talked about. And if we go for the women serving at the combat end, I can't comment on the army, but for the Navy, instantly changed the whole working environment. Not for the best as far as a man would be concerned, because instead of working in a tough military environment with an overwhelmingly male side to it, it became something rather different. And I probably mentioned last time, the first time you go on board a warship and it smells of perfume, something has changed. And this is not necessarily good. So the reduction in numbers was happening, plus we had enforced policy to bring women in. And the gays came in, and the reason that I'm very happy to speak up about that is because with the gays came the predatory gays. And if you look at up-to-date reports, there was a report that came out very recently called Protecting Those That Protect Us. And that's a government report looking effectively at harassment and abuse of women in the armed forces, where over 60% of the serving women are saying that they were sexually harassed or bullied or discriminated against. Clearly, the introduction of women into the armed forces has not been a success. And if the women are disgruntled, of course, that impacts on the male environment itself. And so what I think has been created is a deliberately toxic environment. So the overall performance of the armed forces has dropped. But if you then say by 2030, we're going to have 30% of the armed forces are women, well, what does that really mean? Does that mean on a battlefield, 30% of the troops are going to be women? Because that's not what's happening worldwide. It doesn't matter who's got women in the military. And even if they say the women have full access to combat roles, the reality is in combat, the women are not on the ground. And there's a reason for that. The Israelis, if we take an emotional example in this present environment with Gaza going on, they've got about 4% women. A lot of women killed in the Israeli Defense Forces. I think it's about 550, 560 since the 1960s. But are they putting women into the prime combat zones? No. And I'm not Army, Charles, so I'm sure you can say why.
Well, I mean, that's a situation that has changed, and it's hard to look at it in another light than that which you describe, which is that there appears to be an intentional aim to disrupt, to destabilize. In my own experiences, having served in an infantry regiment, which was therefore populated exclusively by men, the only women that would be in that environment were in sort of administrative roles. So there were women there, and this is not to apportion blame to individuals, but there was drama with that absolutely everywhere, every single time, and that happened. And actually, that happened at the start, going through the training, the year's course at Sandhurst, which is split there at least. Well, actually, I think that may have even changed now. But the girls' platoon, as it was called, I think occasionally there were more, but they were kept in one particular grouping that meant they were all together. But of course, they were the course ran alongside the blokes' side of it, and again there was drama. It didn't matter whether it was between cadets, male and female, or even I say worse, instructors and females. I mean, it happened, and it was completely inevitable. And for anyone to imagine that wasn't going to happen was either willfully naive or, like you say, intentional to create this sort of a problem. I think one thing that is brought out by what you're saying, which I think is an interesting consideration in recruitment, is what is it that the new recruitment service is trying to recruit people into? What are the jobs or the roles that people are supposed to be finding? We hear constantly about how advanced warfare is becoming, about the dependency upon AI, cyber, all of this sort of stuff. Are we suggesting that, in fact, the role of teeth arms, in an army context, people who are infantry or cavalry primarily, so those that are closest to the action, are we to suggest that those sorts of people aren't really going to be needed so much, or not? And therefore, that's how we're going to skin that particular cat. And you think back to February of this year when Luke Pollard, Armed Forces Minister, said, as though people were going to jump up off the sofa and say, right, well, I'll sign up immediately. He said they were going to get rid of, I think it was 100 previous preclusions on a medical basis. And you think, well, how? Okay, some of them might not necessarily mean very much these days, but I rather doubt it. You sort of think if it's a medical issue, it would sort of be there for some sort of a purpose, some kind of reason. In doing away with 100 of them, it's hard to see how you're going to be enabling the enhancement of a fighting force. What sort of people is that going to let in? And then you then do have this issue. I mean, we've talked about the differences between men and women and the inherent problem with putting women alongside men in a service capacity. And as I say, that's not to say there's a problem with the women or there's a problem with the men. It just happens. That's what happens. But then if you're to think, right, well, if we've got people who are sort of, almost medically downgraded, where are they supposed to go? And again, when one thinks about the idea of conscription or national service, or indeed reservists, all these ideas that there are sort of separate groups of people, where do you put them? Do you put them alongside regular serving soldiers, sailors and airmen, or not? And again, if you do or if you don't, you end up with the same sorts of problems, because there are divisions, or there are going to be conflicts and sort of abrasions between those particular groupings of people.
And those conflicts and abrasions are the exact thing you don't want. Absolutely. In a cohesive group of troops.
Exactly.
You don't want that, because you want people to be working as a team, and you want them concentrating on themselves as a team. You don't need disputes.
Yeah. No, entirely. Yes, exactly.
Well, the other bit that comes into my head as you're talking through that, Charles, is that I have watched the war in Ukraine on virtually a daily basis. How do I do that? By very good, and I'm going to say very accurate, social media analysts. But the warfare now in Ukraine, to me, is into a new era, because it's clear that armoured vehicles on the battlefield have a very short survival time. They're being taken out by multi-million-dollar tanks, for example, or field artillery being taken out by relatively cheap drones in very large numbers. And so in the fighting in Ukraine at the moment, the Russians are only moving forward by using very small groups of men, sometimes 4 or 5, with a lot of drone surveillance in order to back them up. But those troops are moving forward, and then they're being asked to engage in combat every bit as brutal as the Second World War, because they are clearing buildings, they're going into trenches, they're clearing fortified strong points. And how are they doing that? Well, they're getting close enough to drop satchel charges, explosives into the underground bunkers. So if you look at what's being expected of the men on the ground, they are being pushed forward in small groups, largely on foot. There has been some use of light vehicles or all-terrain vehicles, even motorbikes, to help them cover ground, and that still goes on. But once they're dismounted from those vehicles, they are into the most grueling combat possible in what they carry, in the amount of weapons and ammunition they got to carry, and then they are on the ground fighting at that level in bunkers and trenches. And we are not seeing the Russians using women. We're not seeing the Ukrainians use women. Now, they are there because they are clearly there. Sniping is one of the things that I believe both sides are using women. And traditionally for the Russians, that's a point of honor, because women snipers in the Second World War did a very good job for the Russians. But are the women being pushed into full frontline combat roles? Not from what I'm seeing. And that's on either side, the Russians or the Ukrainians. So if the most highly experienced military people, and credit to both sides, Ukrainians very brave because they're up against the power of the Russians on the battlefield, so we're going to give credit to both sides. Neither of those two military systems are actually putting women at the front end of the combat. And yet everything we read that's coming through the UK Ministry of Defence is that we need more women, and we are going to put women at the front end. Yeah. So what is going on here? I have to ask a question, because if you say, where are these bizarre policies coming from? Who's actually creating them? I don't know.
No, I mean, I would have to say I don't know either. But it's a very good point you make, and it does fly in the face of the propaganda that suggests that now warfare is going to be more of a tech affair, and that it's not going to involve people doing exactly the things that you're describing. Whereas the reality is that it absolutely does.
Well, to win on the battlefield and take and hold ground is requiring that fighting. Yeah. But if we look at where the drone warfare's got to in Ukraine, we have very, very skilled drone operators now down to the level they're not hunting just vehicles or strong points. They are actually hunting individual groups of men or individuals on the ground. Utterly brutal warfare, which can be done from the comfort of a warm room.
Yeah, and or not even. And it calls into question every element of law that pertains to this, because the idea that those drones could be autonomous and therefore work on the basis of using facial recognition or using methods that mean that the final decision is not made by a human being is frankly astonishing that we could have got to that point. And yet there are many countries that are already doing that. And indeed, in the UK, it's being talked about in such a way that suggests that there's no way we would possibly do it. But by extension and by association, we absolutely will be. The Americans have made such a product, which we doubtless will be working alongside at some point. And that is absolutely a war crime. So, well, I mean, the one standout problem with it, I mean, okay, I don't want to conflate two different things, but in using sort of AI autonomous decision-making processes. There was an event, a sort of tabletop event, a couple of years ago in which this technology was being trialled, and at it there was a scenario reported where an automated drone system was tasked with destroying, I forget what the target actually was, but anyway, the final say-so was by the drone operator. And because the system believed, I mean, okay, they're not sentient, but effectively it reasoned via its programming system that the only obstacle to achieving its mission was the operator in the chair. It tried to kill the operator. So, the suggestion that any of this can work properly, especially if it's in an autonomous context, is absolutely ridiculous. And it doesn't in any way get away from what you are describing, which is all of this requires people. And okay, the statistics.
Sorry, Charles, people that are going to be killed. And this is where the casualty figures from Ukraine matter.
They do. This is it. Yeah. They absolutely do. And this is what this is where we come back to the numbers, and how on earth can we be talking on the one hand about being able to face any foe anywhere in the world at the same time as having a total strength across all three armed forces of virtually nothing?
180,000 roughly.
Yeah.
And by 2030, the government is going to say that 60,000, 33%.
Yeah,
60,000, 50,000 are going to be women.
Said to be women, exactly. And how's that going to happen? And this is what brings us into what I think is such an interesting area, which is why early on, I referred to conscription, and this is exactly why I think we need to limit ourselves slightly for the confines of this discussion, but to look back certainly to 1914 and perhaps more in particular to 1939, and just to see how incredibly quickly things can change. And I say that now we are in September 2025. We have just seen a summer in the United Kingdom that has been dominated by an agenda that concerns, in the first instance, sort of a backlash against a deliberately fumbled migration policy that's been going on for years, and the response to it with many possible conclusions, one of which looks like being digital identity. But alongside this, there's been an engineered stimulation of patriotic fervour, and that's expressed itself in rallies, most recently a very big gathering in London, the waving and sort of flying of Union flags and St George's crosses in particular. And actually, interestingly, having just been to Scotland, much less so in Scotland, but that's slightly by the by. The point is that people are being galvanised by the notion of Britishness, and I think that's a really important thing to mention, because when we consider the remarks of somebody like Fiona Hill, who is influential because she's just written a document which gifts the defence industry the means by which to make billions, to further influence policy and effectively start this ball rolling, it is not too much of a leap to see how a change in circumstance or change in reporting of the threat from, let's say, Russia, because that is the most obvious and most likely one, could wield that, as I describe it, sort of patriotic fervour towards recruitment in some form. And you go back to, think of 1914, we think of the Kitchener, your country needs you, and the response to that. I mean, in the First World War, there was no need to introduce conscription until 1916. Such was the effect of the sort of response to that. Yeah. But in 1939, not so. The Military Training Act of 1939 came in May, and so people at that point between the ages of 20 and 22 were being called forward for 6 months training, and that was sort of immediate. And then, of course, at the outbreak of war, the National Service Act conscripted millions of people at a stroke. And you know, I think it's very easy to have these conversations and people be listening, thinking, oh, you know, it's not going to happen again. It can't happen again. Okay, well, in which case, explain to me why in the conscription publication that I referred to earlier from the House of Commons Library, why does it explicitly reference the changes as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? It's because it's making it clear that things can change on a sixpence. I mean, you know, if we'd had this conversation in 2019 and there'd been the suggestion that people would refuse to go to church or hug each other or, you know, or any of the terrible things that happened, we would have dismissed it out of hand. And yet that's exactly what happened. And so the idea now that people are desperate to sort of prove their love of country and all the rest of it, I mean, the conditions are, frankly, ripe for the suggestion of, okay, well, I'll tell you what you can do with that. You can come and join the armed forces. That's how to demonstrate the love of your country.
And they are specifically targeting youngsters. And I've commented that the Defence HQ, so the UK's Ministry of Defence, has boasted that it's got more cadets, so young teenagers. It's got more cadets than people in the British Army. So it's clear that the government's eye is on young people, and in this recruitment initiative, it's clearly looking to bring those into the military as fast as possible, because one of the aims of the armed forces recruitment system is that they're going to give somebody a job offer with conditions within 10 days. And then this is going to be finalised in 30 days. And the reason they're doing this is under the past failing system, a huge number of potential recruits to the military were leaving because they just got fed up with the waiting time. Yes. So the figure I've got here on the piece of paper in front of me is 74,000 potential recruits of 137,000 gave up because the whole process was too long. So the government is clearly saying we want to grab hold of these youngsters that start to show some interest. And just because I think it is an interesting background, when you look at Serco, that's being given the 1.5 billion contract, it isn't just Serco. There's a whole range of companies. So we've got Pegasus Systems, we've got Adico, Acodis, TMP, Optima Health, PA Consulting, and then the military preparation colleges. But all of the commercial organisations, these are generally global, or at least major UK recruitment companies, invariably now with business development and AI decision-making locked into it. So we've got world innovators, designers, consultants, digital experts, scientists, and technologists, all apparently required now in order to recruit people into the military. And I find this utterly bizarre because my logic is the more you get into these companies, the less they actually understand what you should be doing to try and recruit people into the military.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It's total gravy train for these guys. And actually, amusing on a sort of lighter note, if you go to the Serco Armed Forces Recruiting Service page, they, of course, are recruiting for recruiters. So one wonders, with, you know, in this 1.5 billion spend, I mean, how much has to go on creating the very system itself and then filtering it down to all those organisations in order to try to make the whole thing run in the first place. And you'd think, with the terrible track record that Capita have had over the period that they've been running it, that lessons would be learned. And in fact, the chief lesson really would have been that it never should have gone out of house in the first place. I mean, you know, that if you want people to get it right, it should be held within. So, people who are serving, people who have that ability to communicate exactly what it is that they're looking for and give some sense of what it's like and all the rest of it. And also that they've got skin in the game. I mean, why would somebody working for Serco or any of the other businesses that you mentioned, why would they care?
Or why would they be better than somebody
indeed,
who is currently serving
well, I think we know they
recently?
wouldn't. Exactly. Yeah. No, indeed. And this is the, I mean, well, perhaps this drags us off sideways, but this the sort of the outsourcing of everything. This is just another example of how, well, I say disaster. It's obviously great for all the organisations that are involved, except for the ones that are supposed to be benefited by it, which in this instance is the armed forces. So, yes, I mean, exactly how this will play out, sort of, as we said at the start, it is hard to tell, because what is the need for war, in a sense, in that the government has put up a huge number of sort of reasons that could easily be pushed further into making a proper case for war. And it, historically, of course, well, we can get into the sort of wars being bankers' wars and all that sort of stuff, but really, at a national government level in the United Kingdom, war has the gift of being an absolutely enormous distraction from everything else. It also enables you to blame war for everything. That's going wrong.
Yeah.
And indeed, like we saw after the First World Wars and the Second World Wars, to change things because people have got used to being led's perhaps the wrong word, but being pushed by a government in a way that they wouldn't necessarily accept outside of those times, the sort of the emergency powers and all that kind of thing. And when we think about education, agriculture, health, infrastructure, all the things that changed so very dramatically after the First and Second World Wars, all the things that we report on UK column as things that we are suggesting are coming down the track. Another very, very effective way of catalysing all those processes is, of course, to have a war. But exactly what would tip us over into such a situation is not clear, because if it were genuine, it would be, if we're talking about, I mean, at the moment, the most obvious vehicle is this idea that there should be a reassurance force in Ukraine, and that somehow we get caught up in that, and then that would lead to a proper bloody conflict. But to imagine that could be anything other than catastrophic is impossible.
Yeah. And this, of course, is something that the government is absolutely lying to the British public on a daily basis, because they are never actually describing the war as it's being conducted. And I've come onto the subject of casualties, and to me, this is one of the key things for understanding how, you could say, naive the Ministry of Defence is being here, or the British government, but it's not naivety, it's propaganda, it's manipulation of the public. But is the UK public, or would the UK public support UK involvement in Ukraine if they really understood it kicks off from peacekeeping to the fact that we've become engaged in the fighting, and we are going to be talking 100, 300, 500 casualties a day. Yeah. And of course, nobody wants to talk about this, but this is the reality of the intensity of the fighting on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so the idea that we're going to put our minuscule army, because what is the statement, Charles? 20,000 men in the field for a relatively short space of time. British Army's capability at the moment. So if we said 20,000 and they are involved in frontline combat, then casualties in the Ukrainian war, as it is, are going to be running at about 300 men a day.
Yeah.
And where's that going to take us? It's going to take us in a bad place pretty quickly.
Very bad. Absolutely it would.
So, yeah, it does seem that Ukraine and their obsession with Ukraine, and we're not going to abandon Ukraine, and we're going to pump in the money, and we need to get people on the ground in Ukraine, not to fight, but as peacekeepers. This seems to be a ruse which is taking us closer and closer towards some form of military engagement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Brian. And I mean, I was just going to say, I think the situation in terms of its potential is being, the government here certainly spent the last 3 years sort of bolstering that position in making all these treaties and agreements and commitments and everything else. The most recently, obviously, what was it called? The 100-year, stand with Ukraine for 100 years or so.
100-year pact.
Yeah. So something like that, meaningless and empty and pointless as it may seem, is of course exactly the card that can be played when the situation gets to a certain point and say, well, I mean, we've signed this pact now. We're committed. We've got to send people. And I think with a cleverly run media campaign, I think that is exactly the sort of message that could change the situation. Exactly how, I don't know, because the limited research that we have seen and that we have done that concerns young people's opinions on joining an armed force and indeed fighting for this government or this country or whatever they think that might entail, has suggested overwhelmingly that people are not prepared to do it. Now, I think there are a combination of factors involved there, one of which I think you're absolutely right to identify is the way in which people have been so demoralised by the downward spiral in terms of numbers, the way in which the process has been totally mauled, and therefore the negativity that sort of pervades the organisation within and without. So to turn that around, I think would be very, very difficult psychologically to suddenly get people sort of boosted into thinking that that's what they would want to do. But I still believe it's possible in some way. Now, if that goes alongside some sort of halfway house legislation, a bit like what I've described with the Military Service Act and the National Service Acts and those sorts of things, but something that falls between them. And I mean, let's not forget, it was only last year that Rishi Sunak in the general election campaign was suggesting conscription, and it sort of tried to cover all bases or make it sound a bit softer than he meant by saying that, well, part of it would be a civil activity, civil whatever. But when he was pushed on it, he absolutely said, well, if people didn't do it, then I forget the exact words he used, but it's something like that, their bank accounts would be frozen. So I mean, it wasn't off the cuff. Clearly, it had been thought about, and okay, you could say, well, that's all history, but it's not, because as we know,
it's under the surface.
Exactly. It's an extension of the same thing. What we're seeing now.
And the other bit I'd introduce into that is, if you look back as to the reasons why conscription was stopped, it was overwhelmingly because the armed forces themselves said conscripts are giving us more problems than we're gaining from having the numbers of the conscripts on board. So, and for people who might not realise this is the basis that if you have a volunteer army, you have volunteer armed forces, people are doing a job they want to do, and therefore their whole mindset is locked into the system. They want to do the job. They want to be good at it. They enjoy doing the job. We're not specifically talking about killing on the battlefield here. We're talking about the training environment, the lifestyle. And conscripts can be an absolute nightmare because overwhelmingly they don't want to be there. So they are going to do their best to do as little as possible to get through their conscripted time with as little hassle as possible, and they want to get out the other end in one piece. And so conscripts sound good, but in reality they're not good, because effectively they're going to produce poor quality troops.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it goes back to the point about women or any other group that's distinct from a voluntary, volunteer regular force. Where do you put the others? How do you make that work?
Yeah.
And there's not really any evidence to suggest particularly that it does work. So exactly, yet another gigantic problem that's not being addressed, or at least at the moment, all of this is put out in sort of entirely theoretical terms, which is disingenuous, because it can't be theoretical. If it's theoretical, then why on earth are governments of Europe or NATO being asked to commit 5% of their spending to defence, or so-called defence? That there can only be one reason. This idea of strength through peace. Sorry, wrong way around. Peace through strength.
Yeah.
It's there's only so far you can push this stuff before something's got to give. And I think the very serious point that falls out of that is that these sorts of things do have a they gather a momentum of their own, and once something starts, okay.
Well, it's mission creep, isn't it?
It is.
Vietnam
Classic.
has got to be a classic example of that,
absolutely
where
has. Yeah.
Each year as the conflict went on, more and more American troops were brought in until they, from the initial, 120,000, I think we were up to 500,000, and still that wasn't enough to deal with the conflict.
Yeah.
And Ukraine has got the opportunity, where everything is set in my mind, in Ukraine to suck in many more troops than that.
Yes.
And ultimately, Western troops are going to be up against an experienced army in the field, and this has huge implications.
It does, and I think people should be more concerned about it. I think this is sort of a fag packet calculation, but I think in this country at the minute, in the United Kingdom at the moment, I think the population, the male population between the ages of 18 and 41, which were the conscripted ages in the Second World War, that's about 10 million people. And I would say of those 10 million, very, very few are thinking that this could in any way be a reality. But I'm afraid to say, I think that it could absolutely be.
And just as we come towards the end, really, but one of the triggers for me is that we've now got France and UK setting up the multi-force headquarters, which I think is going to be northward in London, with initially the Brits taking the lead, but working with the French. And clearly that's going to mean more British and French military on the ground in Ukraine. Now, of course, we're always told they're going to be there for training and observing, but the reality is that they're doing a lot more than that. They're going to be involved in the battlefield command and control chain, in order to learn about the war that's being conducted. And from the Russian point of view, and I think it's a very reasonable point of view, if you have Western troops, be it French, British, German, whoever it's going to be, actually on the ground helping the Ukrainians to conduct the combat, those troops become legitimate targets. So I see that as we've now stepped into, we're going to have this additional headquarters in order to ramp up our military capability in Ukraine. The risks of an HQ or a cell of Brits and French being taken out is increases dramatically. And then, of course, should that happen, the government here is going to say, oh, well, we were attacked by the Russians, the nasty Russians, it's all their fault. Now we need another 50,000 troops. And this is how it ramps up.
It's exactly, absolutely. It's exactly how it starts. Yeah. And again, I mean, this is something that we at UK Column have very much warned about and brought out into the open. But how much regard people are paying it, I think not a lot.
At the moment.
At the moment, exactly.
A message for the young people who are going to be targeted by the government. What would you... I've got to say, I know what I'd be saying to them at the moment, but...
Think very hard, I would say. Think very hard about why things are as they are and where they might go, I would say.
absolutely right. For me, I think that good people will fight for their country when they perceive that there's a real need to lay down their life for their country and their communities and their families. They will do it. But we're in an era now where we're not even sure who we're fighting for. Are we going to be fighting for the UK, or are we fighting for some joint French-European political objective? This is where I say to these young people, it's one thing to die in order to protect your country and your family, but it's another thing to be dying because of what? Some European bureaucrat that's decided they want to expand the European Union to include Ukraine. So I'd be saying you want to think very carefully.
Yeah, quite agree.
Yeah. We'll end there, I think.
Yeah, that's
good. Charles, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Brian. I look forward to the next one.
Thank you.